You want to know what a wedding dress looks like after it has run 4 lanes of highway traffic in July heat, dragged through gravel and cornfield dust, one heel gone, the hem shredded to threads. You want to know what it sounds like when 300 motorcycles idle at once, waiting on a woman none of them have met, yet to decide whether she trusts them. Stay until the end. You will understand why a torn piece of lace is bolted behind glass in a garage in Missouri, and why the woman who put it there still checks that the frame is level every single morning before she opens the bay door. Tell us in the comments what town you're watching from. This one is worth the whole ride. She is 63 now, gray coming in silver at her temples, and she still parks her bike the same way she did 30 years ago. Nose out, kickstand set twice, helmet hung on the same mirror bolt. The girl beside her is 14, her brother's granddaughter, visiting for the summer because her parents thought the quiet might do her good after a year that had not been kind to any of them. The girl has heard pieces of the story her whole life, the way children hear the outline of a family myth. A bride, a highway, 300 bikes, without ever being told what any of it weighed. "That's it?" the girl asks, looking at the frame on the garage wall. Inside it, yellowed now, is a strip of lace no longer than a forearm, its edge torn ragged rather than cut. "That's it," the woman says. The garage smells the way it has smelled for 40 years. Cured leather, two-stroke oil, the mineral tang of a concrete floor that has never once been sealed properly. Outside, past the open bay door, the highway runs east to west exactly as it always has, heat already rising off the asphalt, though it is not yet 9 in the morning. A single truck passes, engine noise swelling and falling away, and then the road is quiet again, the way rural highways are quiet, not empty, just patient. "Grandpa said you knew her before anybody else did," the girl says, "that you didn't even chase her." "No," the woman says, "I waited." She sits down on the stool beside her workbench, the one with the cracked vinyl seat she has never replaced, because replacing it feels like erasing something. The girl waits, the way you learn to wait around people who tell stories slowly, on their own time, in their own order. "It was August," the woman says finally, "a Saturday, hot enough that the tar was soft at the shoulder of the road. I remember, because my boots left prints in it walking back to the bike." She looks toward the door, toward the light coming in flat and white off the asphalt. "I'd stopped for gas, that's all. I wasn't looking for anything that day." The girl doesn't move. Somewhere down the road, a car passes going the other direction, and the sound of it takes a long time to fade. The gas station sat where the highway bent slightly north before straightening out again toward the county line, a low building with 2 pumps and a hand-lettered sign advertising boiled peanuts that nobody had refreshed since spring. She remembers the smell of it, diesel and cut grass and something Swedish underneath, spilled soda gone tacky on the concrete. She remembers paying inside because the card reader on pump 2 had been broken since June, and the woman behind the counter had a box fan turned sideways, blowing across her own face and not much else. She was 31 years old that summer. Divorced 2 years by then, the paperwork long since filed and forgotten in a drawer, though some things about a marriage do not file away so easily. She had ridden alone that day, no patch on her back yet, just a woman and a machine, and 400 miles she meant to put between herself and a town she no longer claimed. "You rode alone," the girl says. Not quite a question. Back then, mostly. Before. She flexes her hand once, an old habit, checking a joint that aches now in weather like this. The girl watches the motion without understanding it, the way the young watch the old perform small rituals whose origins have gone quiet. "I was checking my mirror," the woman says, getting ready to pull out, and that's when I saw her, not running yet, standing at the edge of the lot, where the gravel meets the grass, like she was deciding something. Deciding what? I didn't know yet. That's the thing about people at the edge of a decision. You can see the shape of it on them before you know what it is. She looks down at her hands, at the calluses that have softened only slightly over 10 years. She had on a dress. White. Not new-looking, even then, even before it got torn. Outside, the light has shifted, sliding lower across the bay door, catching the chrome of nothing in particular, because the motorcycles that once filled this garage are elsewhere now, scattered to driveways and other lives. The girl follows her grandmother's gaze toward the door, as if she might see the woman in white standing there still, 31 years old herself once, in another version of the story. I didn't do anything, the woman says. Not at first. That's important. I want you to understand that part before I tell you the rest. She pauses, and the pause has weight to it, the particular weight of someone deciding how much a 9-year-old, no, she corrects herself silently. The girl is 12 now. How much a 12-year-old ought to carry of a stranger's fear. Some people, when they're that scared, if you move toward them too fast, they run further. So I just stood there, by my bike, and I watched her. The girl doesn't ask what happened next. She has learned, in the 20 minutes they've been standing in this garage, smelling of old oil and cut grass drifting in from the field beyond the road, that the story comes in its own order, at its own speed, and that hurrying it only makes the woman go quiet in a different way, not the good quiet, the closed one. So she waits. The woman's eyes have gone somewhere else now, back to a Tuesday in July, when the asphalt was soft enough to hold a boot print, and the corn in the fields stood chest-high and green-black in the heat. She remembers the specific sound the woman in white had made crossing the last lane of traffic. Not a scream, nothing so simple as a scream, but a kind of exhale, forced out of her like something had been sitting on her chest for a long time and had just now let go enough for her to breathe and run at the same time. She didn't look back at the road, the woman says. That's the thing I noticed. People who are running from a person look back. She wasn't running from a person. Not exactly. She was running from a version of her own life that hadn't happened yet. She shakes her head slightly, as if arguing with her younger self across the distance of 10 years. I didn't understand that then. I understood it about an hour later. The girl shifts her weight, glances at the corner of the garage, where a shape sits under a canvas tarp, roughly bike-sized, though she hasn't been allowed to look yet. What was she wearing on her feet? The woman looks at her granddaughter for a long moment, surprised, the way you're surprised when someone young asks exactly the right question without knowing it's the right one. Nothing, she says. That's what I mean about the calluses. Hers were fresh, torn open in 2 places by the time she got to the field. She'd run 4 lanes of Highway 60 barefoot in the middle of August, and she didn't so much as look down at her own feet the whole time I was watching her. She lets that sit. You remember that kind of thing, not because it's dramatic, because it tells you what she'd already decided was less important than getting away. Outside, a truck passes on the road, slow, its engine a low drone that rises and fades, and for a moment neither of them speaks, listening to it the way you listen to something that isn't quite the sound you're waiting for. She stood at the edge of that cornfield, the woman says finally, for 11 minutes before she came to me. I counted. I've never told anyone I counted, but I did. The granddaughter shifts on the stool, the vinyl creaking under her, and does not ask why 11 minutes mattered enough to count. The woman appreciates that. She has told this story exactly 4 times in 10 years, and the ones worth telling it to are the ones who let a silence finish before they fill it with a question. You have to understand what that field looked like, she says. Corn shoulder high, tasseling out, so it moved even when there wasn't any wind you could feel on your skin. Heat coming up off the blacktop in that way that bends the horizon. My bike was still ticking, cooling down, the way they do. And there was this scrap of white lace hanging off my mirror, moving a little, like it was trying to signal something to nobody. She looks toward the bay door, toward the highway beyond it, as if some part of her is still standing on that shoulder in 2014. I didn't walk toward her. That was the thing. Every instinct in every one of us, Deacon, Mouse, the rest, every one of them wanted to go into that field and get her, pull her out like you'd pull somebody from a wreck. And I put my hand up. Just a hand up, palm out, low, the way you'd stop traffic you weren't sure was going to stop for you. Why? Because I knew what it looks like when somebody's been grabbed enough times that being grabbed gently still feels like being grabbed. She says it plainly, without weight, the way you'd state a fact about weather or distance. I'd been married to a man who used to say he was just trying to help me when he had my arm, so I stood there, boots in the gravel, engine ticking, sun coming down like a hand on the back of your neck, and I waited. The granddaughter's eyes have gone somewhere private, somewhere the woman recognizes but doesn't chase. There will be time for that conversation. Later, maybe. Not today. 11 minutes, the woman says again, is a long time to stand still in August heat, watching corn move, and not knowing if a person's going to come out of it at all. Long enough to think she might just keep going. Long enough for Mouse to ask, twice, real quiet, whether we ought to call it in. And I told him no, not yet, because I'd seen her face when she looked back at the road, right before she went in, and it wasn't the face of someone who wanted sirens. She reaches over, finally, and touches the edge of the frame on the wall. Not the veil itself, just the wood around it, the way you'd touch a door frame you've passed through 10,000 times. And then the corn moved different, she says. Not when different, person different, and there she was. She had come out of the corn the way something wounded comes out of cover, low and slow, and testing the air before committing to the open, not running anymore. That part of her was spent. What was left was a woman walking on the outsides of her feet because the soles had already given up somewhere back in that field, arms crossed over a bodice gone gray with dust and sweat, the veil torn clean away at the comb so that what remained of her hair hung loose and stuck to her neck in dark ropes. She stopped at the edge of the ditch where the gravel started, and she looked at the bikes the way a person looks at a locked door they're not sure is locked. The woman didn't move toward her. That was the thing the granddaughter would need to understand later, when she was older, when she had her own version of this moment waiting somewhere down the road for her. You do not move toward a person who has just spent everything she had on getting away. You let the distance be hers to close. I said her name wasn't asked, the woman tells the granddaughter now, because I hadn't asked it yet. First thing I said to her wasn't a question at all. She pauses, and the garage holds the pause the way it holds the smell of old oil and cut grass drifting in through the bay door. I said, "You don't have to come any closer than you want to." That's it, just that. The girl asks what happened next, barely above a whisper, like she's afraid the story might startle and go back into the corn itself. She came closer anyway, the woman says. Maybe 8 feet. Stopped again. And I could see then what the heat had done to her. Lips cracked, one eye swelling from where something had caught her. A wedding dress that probably cost more than my bike sale that year, ruined below the knee with mud and corn silk. She shakes her head, slow, the memory arriving in pieces the way memories that matter always do. Mouse went for his water bottle. I put my hand out, told him wait. Wasn't time for that yet either. She wasn't thirsty first. She was scared first. And you don't hand a scared person water like that, solves the scared part. The granddaughter is quiet, watching her grandmother's face the way you watch someone reading a letter they've read 100 times before. So I just stood there, the woman continues, boots still in the gravel, and I let her look at all of us, 22 riders, patches, ink, dust, and I let her decide for herself what kind of danger we were, because that was her right, after the morning she'd had. And after a while, she looked past me, past the bikes, down the highway toward town. Her voice drops, the way it does when she reaches the part that still costs her something to say, and she asked me if I knew anybody who wasn't going to make her go back. The granddaughter shifts against the workbench, and the old woman lets the question sit there a moment before she answers it, because some questions deserve the weight of silence before words get put on top of them. I told her the truth, she says. I told her I didn't know a soul who was going to make her do anything. Not that day, not any day after. She looks down at her own hands, the knuckles thick now with 40 years of clutch levers and cold mornings, and turns them over, like she's checking they're still the same hands that did what she's about to describe. But I also told her I wasn't going to promise her a fairy tale, because fairy tales are how people get hurt twice. I said, whatever happened to you back there, it still happened. Riding off with us doesn't erase it. It just means you're not alone carrying it anymore. The girl asks if that scared her, saying something so plain to someone so frightened, and the woman almost smiles, the kind of smile that has more history in it than humor. Scared me plenty. Plain truth always does. But she needed truth more than comfort right then. Comfort's easy to give and easy to take back. Truth you can build on. She walks a few steps toward the open bay door, the highway beyond it flat and shimmering, even in memory, and the granddaughter follows because that's what you do with someone telling you something that matters. You follow the direction they're looking. She didn't cry when I said it. That's the part I remember clearest. She just nodded, once, like she'd been waiting a long time for somebody to stop asking her to be fine. Mouse, the woman explains, finally got to hand over that water bottle then, and Coralie drank like her body had been rationing itself for hours, which it probably had. Someone draped a jacket over her shoulders despite the heat, not because she was cold, but because bare arms in a crowd of strangers feel less bare with something covering them. That was the moment, the old woman says, when I understood we weren't driving her anywhere yet. We were just going to sit with her on the shoulder of Highway 60 until she trusted her own legs again. The granddaughter glances at the veil in its frame, the lace gone the color of old piano keys, and asks what happened next, how 22 riders became 300, how a torn hem became a court case. The old woman's eyes go somewhere distant, toward the corn that isn't there anymore, toward a phone call she made from a gas station payphone because her cell had no signal that far out. Next, she says, I had to figure out who to call first, because the wrong first call, in a thing like this, can undo everything the right ones after it are trying to fix. The old woman shifts her weight against the workbench, the way people do when a memory asks something physical of them before it will let itself be told. The granddaughter waits. Out through the open bay door, a truck passes on the highway, its sound rising and falling like something breathing. I didn't call the club first, the old woman says. I called a woman I knew from a support meeting in Springfield, 15 years sober, worked intake at the county prosecutor's office. I figured if anyone would know whether what Coralie was telling me was a crime or just a bad Tuesday, it'd be her. She says it plainly, no drama in it, because that is how the actual moment had felt. Not cinematic, just a woman standing at a payphone with a phone card bought inside a gas station that sold live bait and lottery tickets, reading numbers off a card gone soft with age, while 22 motorcycles idled on gravel behind her like something holding its breath. The friend had listened, had asked 3 questions, then a 4th, had gone quiet in a way that told the old woman, even through a bad connection, that quiet meant, this is real. And not, this is nothing. She told me 2 things, the old woman says. Get her to write down everything she remembered, times, names, what she saw signed, while it was still fresh, and don't take her near the courthouse or the church or anywhere near that family until there was someone official standing between her and them. Because a scared woman walking into an office alone is a rumor. A scared woman walking in with a paper trail and witnesses is a case. Point. The granddaughter, 16 and unused yet to how much of the world runs on which document was signed and when, asks what Coralie had actually seen. The old woman doesn't answer that directly. Not yet, her eyes say. Not until she's told it in the order it happened, because order was the thing that mattered, the thing her friend had insisted on more than anything else. So I went back to the group, she says, and I told them, nobody rides toward that wedding today. And not yet. Today we get her someplace safe, and we get her talking into a recorder, and tomorrow, if it's what it sounds like it is, we call every chapter within 4 hours of here. She looks at the veil again, at the thread of lace still caught, all these years later, in the exact pattern it had torn in. That was the hardest thing I did that whole week, she says. Not driving, waiting. The girl waits, the way young people do when they think silence is a gap that needs filling, rather than a room that needs sitting in. The old woman doesn't fill it. She lets the quiet stretch the way it had stretched that afternoon 10 years ago, in the shade behind a Motel 6 off Route 60, where she'd parked Coralie in the passenger seat of a borrowed truck and told her to breathe. Just breathe. Nobody's coming for you here. She didn't want the recorder at first, the old woman says finally. Wouldn't look at it. Kept saying she didn't have anything. No proof. Nothing but what she'd heard through a door. Her hand moves without her seeming to notice it, tracing the edge of the veil's frame, the way you'd touch a scar you'd stopped being surprised by. I told her a voice is proof. A date and a time and a name is proof. You just have to say it in the right order, to the right person, before anyone has a reason to doubt you. What Coralie had heard, she says now, was the officiant's own voice, low and businesslike, on the other side of a thin motel wall 2 nights before the wedding, negotiating a fee with the groom's mother, not for a blessing, not for a ceremony, but for a signature, a backdated signature, a license that would show a marriage 3 weeks older than the one about to happen, timed to slide neatly under a filing deadline in probate court, so that a dead man's estate would pass, cleanly, uncontested, into the hands of a son who married before a Tuesday that had already come and gone. She didn't understand all of it that night, the old woman says. Neither did I. Not right away. It took a lawyer to draw the picture whole. But she understood enough. She understood a man's voice saying $8,000, cash, like it was the price of a used truck. She looks toward the open bay door, at the highway running flat and pale beyond it, heat already rising off the asphalt in thin, trembling ropes even this early. That's the part that undid her. Not the fraud. The number. $8,000 for her whole life. And somebody thought that was a fair price. The granddaughter is quiet a long moment, doing the arithmetic teenagers do without meaning to, what her own life would go for, whether anyone would think it a bargain. So you believed her, she says. Just like that. Not just like that. The old woman shakes her head slowly. I believe the tremor in her hands didn't match a woman making something up. Liars fidget for attention. Scared people fidget to keep from flying apart. She picks up the framed veil, sets it back exactly where it had been, squares it to the wall with the care of a woman who has done this 100 times and will do it 100 more. Then I made some calls, she says, and by nightfall, there were bikes coming in from 3 states who hadn't asked me a single question about why. The granddaughter shifts against the workbench, arms crossed against a chill that has nothing to do with the morning air. They just came, because you called. That's the brotherhood part nobody understands from the outside. The old woman wipes her palms on her jeans, though they are already clean, an old habit worn smooth by repetition. It isn't blind loyalty, it's earned trust, paid out like interest on an account you've been putting into for 20 years without knowing when you'd need to withdraw. She nods toward the door, toward the highway, as if the road itself kept the ledger. I'd ridden 400 miles to sit outside a hospital once for a man I barely knew, because his brother asked me to. Nobody explained that either. You just go. The girl studies the veil's frame, the way the glass catches the early light, and throws it back gold instead of white. What did the bride do? While you were making calls. She sat right there. The old woman points to an overturned crate near the workbench, unremarkable, gray with age, the kind of thing that has held 100 different weights and asked nothing of any of them. Wrapped in my jacket. Wouldn't take coffee, wouldn't take a blanket even though she was shaking. Kept saying she didn't want to be any trouble, like trouble was a debt she'd already maxed out on somebody else's account. She pauses. That's the thing about people who've been made to feel like a burden their whole life. Kindness scares them worse than cruelty does. Cruelty they know what to do with. Outside, a truck passes, engine doppering low and away, and for a moment neither of them speaks, letting the sound fade back into the flat hum of the highway. By midnight, the old woman continues, we had riders bunked 2 and 3 to a room at the motel off Route 9, and some just sleeping against their bikes in the lot, because there wasn't room left inside. 300 of them by the second morning. Nobody storming anything. No torches, no theatrics. That's television, not us. Just people making sure one girl's word would reach the right desk before a piece of paper could reach a courthouse. How did you know which prosecutor to trust? The old woman's mouth curves, not quite a smile. I didn't, at first. That took another 12 hours and a man named... She stops herself, waves a hand as if brushing away a name that still costs her something to say out loud, even now, even a decade later. A man who owed me a favor from a different life. That's a different part of the story. She looks at the girl steadily. You want to hear it in order, or you want to keep jumping to the end like your mother does? The girl considers this the way children consider most adult offers of control, as if it might be a trick. In order, she says finally, but don't skip the part where you were scared. I was scared for 2 days straight, the old woman says. Scared is not something you outgrow. You just get better at riding through it. She shifts her weight against the garage door frame, and the aluminum groans under her, the way it has groaned under her for 11 years now, a sound the girl has never once heard her acknowledge. The favor was from before your mother was born, before this garage had a floor poured in it even. I worked dispatch for a trucking outfit out of Joplin, nights, and there was a young public defender who used to call in, asking about a driver nobody could locate, a man who'd seen something he shouldn't have on a delivery route. I found the driver. Didn't ask questions I didn't want answered. The lawyer remembered that for 20 years, the way people remember the ones who didn't ask. So you called him. I called him at 2 in the morning, and he didn't hang up on me, which told me everything about the kind of man he'd become. She points, unnecessarily, toward the phone on the workbench, an old black rotary thing bolted there as decoration now, not function. He wasn't a prosecutor by then. He was clerking for one, but he knew which office would move fast, and which one would sit on it for a favor of its own. Her eyes go somewhere the girl can't follow. Somewhere past the bay door and the highway and the heat shimmering off it in identical waves to the ones from that summer. That's the part nobody puts in the version they tell at bars. It wasn't the 300 bikes that saved her. It was one tired man at a desk who decided to believe a woman with torn feet over a family with a lawyer on retainer. What happened to her feet? The old woman doesn't answer right away. She looks at the girl the way she looked at the bride once, all those years ago, sizing up how much a person could carry before the carrying broke them. She'd run 4 lanes of highway barefoot in July, she says at last. Asphalt like that doesn't forgive anybody. We wrapped her feet in a mechanic's rag before we even had her name. She taps the workbench twice. An old habit, a period at the end of a sentence she isn't ready to finish. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before the phone call, before the motel, before any of the 300, there was just her, standing at the edge of that cornfield, deciding whether I was safe enough to walk toward. The old woman's eyes went somewhere else then, past the girl, past the open bay door, into the flat gold light of a July that hadn't finished with her yet. She had been sitting on the bike, engine ticking as it cooled, when she first saw the shape at the tree line, not moving, a smudge of white against green so dark it looked black in the heat glare, the kind of green that only comes after weeks without rain and one violent thunderstorm the night before, the corn still beaded with it, steaming faintly where the sun hit. She didn't call out. That was the first thing she did right, though she wouldn't have called it a decision at the time, more like an old instinct surfacing, something learned in a marriage that had taught her exactly how loud noise could break a person open. She'd learned the shape of fear a long time before that summer. She recognized it the way a man recognizes his own handwriting on an old letter, not because he remembers writing it, but because some part of the hand still knows. So she waited. She lit a cigarette she didn't finish. She let the bike tick down to silence, let the traffic on the highway thin to nothing, let a crow start up in the ditch behind her, because the world does not stop being the world, just because someone is deciding whether to trust you. 20 minutes, maybe longer. Long enough that her knees had gone stiff from standing still, long enough that she'd started counting corn stalks instead of watching the woman, because watching too hard is its own kind of violence. Then the shape moved. Small steps, the kind of walking that isn't really walking so much as failing to stand still in one place any longer. The dress dragging behind her, hem black with ditch mud, the missing veil leaving a strange bareness at her crown, like a candle blown out. "You don't have to talk," the old woman told the girl now, tapping the bench again, was the first thing I ever said to her. Not hello, not are you hurt, just, you don't have to talk. The girl frowned. Why that? Because everybody else in her life that week had wanted something from her mouth, a signature, a yes, a story that made them look good. She picked up the small dented tin box from the shelf, didn't open it, just held it in both hands, like a man holds a hymnal he doesn't sing from anymore. I wanted her to know I wasn't collecting anything, not yet. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, engine brake growling long and low, and for a moment neither of them spoke, letting the sound finish its business before continuing on toward wherever it was going. The girl leaned forward on the bench, elbows on her knees, the way her grandfather used to sit before he died, though she'd never say that out loud. So what happened? After you said that, the old woman set the tin box down again, careful, like it might still wake something if handled wrong. She sat next to me, not close, maybe 4 feet of gravel between us, and she looked at that field like it owed her money. A long breath. 20 minutes, maybe. I didn't check a watch. You stop checking watches around people who are deciding whether the world's safe enough to speak in. The granddaughter's eyes had gone somewhere private, imagining mud-caked lace, imagining a stranger's silence stretched taut as a held note. Then she said one thing, not the whole story. Just, he signed it already. That's all. 4 words. What did that mean? I didn't know yet either. I thought maybe a check, a deed. People sign all kinds of things that ruin them. She shook her head slowly, the motion of someone revisiting a mistake she'd long since made peace with. I didn't push. That was the discipline of it. You don't pull thread out of somebody like that. You let them feed it to you, inch by inch, at whatever speed keeps their hands from shaking. Outside, the light had shifted the way August light does, thickening toward evening, turning the highway's asphalt the color of a healing bruise. The old woman's hand drifted unconsciously to the tin box again, thumb tracing its dented corner the way some men trace old scars, half memory, half apology. Second thing she said was smaller. He wasn't supposed to be a real judge. And that's when the morning stopped being about a runaway girl in a ruined dress and started being about paper, about names on lines, about a courthouse 40 miles east that had no idea what was about to walk through its door. The girl sat very still. You believed her, right off. I believed the 4 feet of gravel, the old woman said. Anybody can lie with words. Nobody fakes the distance they keep between themselves and someone they still think might hurt them. She stood, joints announcing themselves the way they always did now, crossed to the garage's open bay, and looked down the empty highway as though checking, still, out of old habit, for headlights that weren't coming. I radioed the clubhouse before I even knew what I was radioing about. Just said, bring coffee, bring blankets, and bring somebody who knows a real notary from a fake one. She turned back. That's the moment it stopped being mine alone to carry. The girl looked at her hands, as though the word notary had landed somewhere she didn't expect it to. You had somebody like that, just in the club? We had a man who'd spent 11 years doing title work before his knees gave out, and he decided engines were more honest than paperwork. The old woman almost smiled at that, the way people do when a memory arrives dressed better than it deserves. Everybody called him Ledger, not because he was boring, because he could smell a bad signature from across a room. Did he come? On a Tuesday, at 11 in the morning, wearing his church boots because he hadn't had time to change, she said it plainly, the way you'd report weather. He looked at that girl for a long moment before he ever looked at the paper she didn't have yet. That's the kind of man he was. People first. The highway outside the bay door carried a single truck past, engine fading east, and for a moment neither of them spoke, letting the sound finish its sentence before starting another. She still hadn't told you his name, the girl said. The groom's. Not yet. She gave things out the way a person low on water gives out sips, enough to keep you moving, not enough to drown you. The old woman sat back down on the stool, slower this time, the tin box returning to her lap like something that belonged there. What she gave me next wasn't a name either, it was a date. She said, the license gets filed Thursday morning, before 10. His mother has a friend at the county clerk's window. She let that settle. Thursday was 2 days off. 2 days, the girl repeated, as if testing the weight of it. 2 days to get a scared girl in a torn dress in front of the one prosecutor 40 miles away who wouldn't laugh us out of his office, and to do it before a piece of paper made her disappear into somebody else's name for good. She looked at the girl steadily. You understand what a filed license does. It isn't like a stain you can wash out. Once it's in that book, she's fighting a marriage instead of preventing one. Different war, longer one. So you didn't have time to be careful. We had time to be careful. We didn't have time to be slow. The distinction seemed to matter to her. She said it like something she'd repeated to herself many times since. By that afternoon, there were 11 bikes in the yard behind me, engines off, men and women standing around like they were waiting for church to start. Nobody touched her. Nobody crowded her. We'd learned that much, at least, by then. She reached into the tin box and drew out something small, wrapped in a handkerchief gone soft with age, and did not yet unwrap it. The girl's eyes went to the handkerchief and stayed there, the way a child watches a magician's hands, even after learning there's no real magic in them, only patience and misdirection. The woman did not hurry. She had never hurried through this part, not in 10 years of telling it in pieces to people who mostly forgot to ask for the rest. Someone gave her boots, she said instead. That's what I remember first, before the box. Wide feet, size 9, an old pair of engineer boots that belonged to a man who died the winter before. She stood there in that yard with her toes bleeding into the dust, and somebody just walked up and set them down in front of her like an offering at church. Didn't say a word. She put them on and laced them herself. Wouldn't let anyone help with the laces. Why not? Because that was the last thing that was still hers to decide. She turned the handkerchief over once in her palm, feeling its shape without opening it. You have to understand, by that point she'd been told what to wear, what to say, what time to be at the altar, what her name would be by 6 o'clock that evening. Lacing her own boots was the first choice she'd made in 3 days that nobody had made for her first. The girl was quiet, working that through the way she worked through fractions, turning it until it made sense. The prosecutor's office was in Fair Grove, the woman went on. Second floor, above a hardware store, and the elevator didn't work, so we walked her up 2 flights of stairs with about 40 people behind her, and only 3 of us allowed past the door. Her, me, and a woman named Denny, who'd been a court reporter once and knew how to make a story sound like a statement instead of a scream. She smiled faintly at that, some private memory surfacing and receding. The prosecutor was younger than me, had a photograph of his own daughter on the desk, turned toward his chair, not toward the door. I remember thinking that was either arrogance or grief, and I never did find out which. Did he believe her? He believed the paperwork. She'd kept some of it, a receipt, a torn corner of the license application, a text message she'd screenshotted and then deleted, thinking she'd have to. Fear makes people careless in ways that turn out to save them later. She hadn't planned to keep evidence. She'd just been too scared to throw anything away. She finally began working at the folded cloth, slow, deliberate, the way a person opens something they have opened 100 times before, and never once carelessly. That receipt is what's in here. She peeled back the last fold and held it out on her open palm, not yet naming it, letting the girl lean in and look for herself. The girl looked down at what lay in the open palm and did not immediately understand it. A strip of paper, yellowed at the edges, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as fabric, the ink on it faded to the color of weak tea. $31.40, it said, in a printer's font gone thin with age. County clerk's office. A date in June, 10 years and 2 months before the girl had been born. Doesn't look like much, the woman said, for what it did. She did not hand it over. She held it a moment longer, the way a person holds a thing that has outlived its danger but not its weight, and the girl understood without being told that she was allowed to look, but not yet allowed to touch, and that this was not cruelty but instruction. That's the fee, the woman said, for a marriage license application, filed 2 days before the wedding, which was faster than the county usually processed things, which the prosecutor found interesting before he found anything else interesting. The clerk who took the payment remembered the transaction because the man paying it had tried to pay in cash for a fee that was supposed to go through the online portal, and she'd had to explain the system to him twice, and he'd gotten short with her about it. She wrote his irritation into her own memory without meaning to. People do that. They remember the ones who are rude to them long after they forget the ones who are kind. Why did she keep the receipt? She didn't, at first. He did, the groom's father. He'd handed it to her folded inside a card, some old habit of paper trails from a man who trusted nothing, that lived only inside a computer. She found it in her coat pocket 3 weeks later, after everything, when she was washing the coat because it still smelled like the field. A pause. She almost didn't tell the prosecutor about it, thought it was nothing. It took Denny an hour of sitting with her, not asking questions, just sitting, before she remembered it existed at all. The girl's eyes moved from the receipt to the woman's face, and back again, waiting. The date on it, the woman said, was the same date as a wire transfer out of the grandmother's account. Same day, different office, same courthouse. The prosecutor's assistant found that one. Not him. A woman named Teresa, who nobody in this story ever thanks by name, and who deserves to be. She folded the receipt back along its old lines, gentle as closing a hand over something alive. That's how it goes, most times. Not one big proof. A dozen small ones, held by a dozen people too scared or too tired to notice what they were carrying, until somebody finally asks. The garage light shifted as a cloud passed outside, and for a moment the veil in its frame went dim, then bright again. The girl reached out, not quite touching the glass, and asked what happened to the officiant. The woman took her time answering, the way she took her time with most things now, as if speech were a resource that had to be rationed against the years she had left to spend it. He lost his license, she said. That part's public record. You can look it up. What isn't public record is that he tried to reach her, afterward. Wrote a letter. She said the word letter the way some people say a diagnosis. Denny told her not to read it. She read it anyway. What did it say? That he was sorry. That he hadn't known how far the family meant to take it. Only that he'd been told there was a will that needed updating and a marriage that needed to exist on paper before a certain date. The woman shook her head slowly. Might have even been true. Doesn't matter much. A man can be sorry and still have signed the thing. Sorry doesn't undo a signature. The cloud outside finished passing, and full sun came back through the bay door, laying a long, pale rectangle across the concrete floor, cutting close to the toe of the girl's sneaker. She stepped back from it without seeming to notice she'd done it, the way people do around a thing that feels, for no reason they could name, like a line. Did the grandmother go to jail? No, the woman said it flatly. No bitterness in it. Only the exhaustion of a fact she'd made peace with a long time ago. She was 81. Prosecutor didn't want to put an 81-year-old woman in a courtroom on television, and the family's lawyers knew it. And so, what happened was smaller than that. Money went back. Some of it. The rest got called unrecoverable, which is a word they use for money nobody's willing to keep chasing. She looked at the veil. The son. The groom's father. That one did some time. Wire fraud mostly. 18 months. Out in 11. That doesn't seem like enough. No, the woman agreed. It never does. But that's not the part of this that was ever going to be enough. The part that mattered wasn't a sentence. It was that on the day it counted, in the room it counted in, somebody believed her before the paperwork could get filed. Everything after that is just bookkeeping. She set the receipt down on the workbench beside the frame, careful, like it still had somewhere to be. The bookkeeping matters, but it isn't the story. The girl was quiet a moment, working something over. Then what is the story? The woman didn't answer right away. She looked past the girl, toward the open bay door, toward the highway running flat and pale beyond it, and for the first time since they'd come out to the garage, her face did something the girl hadn't seen it do yet. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. I'll get to that, she said. First you need to know what Denny found in the second folder. The girl pulled her knees up onto the stool, the way children do when a story is about to ask something of them, and the woman let the silence sit a while longer before she went on. The second folder, she said, hadn't come from the prosecutor's office at all. It had come from a records clerk in the county seat, a woman near retirement who'd spent 31 years filing marriage licenses and knew, better than anyone, what a rushed one looked like. She'd noticed the date first, filed on a Friday afternoon, 40 minutes before the office closed, the kind of timing that meant somebody wanted it done before anyone could ask questions over a weekend. Then she'd noticed the officiant's signature, the same name that had turned up twice before in filings tied to estate disputes, always for out-of-town couples, always processed fast. She hadn't said anything to anyone for years. She said it herself, later, in a statement Denny kept clipped to the back of the folder, that she'd told herself it wasn't her business, that people got married in a hurry all the time, that suspicion wasn't proof, but she'd kept a private log anyway, dates and names in a marbled notebook she brought from home, because something in her wouldn't let it go quiet. Why not? The girl asked. The woman turned a wrench over in her hand, not using it, just holding it. Because she'd seen her own mother rushed into something once, a signature nobody explained. She never said what came of it. She didn't have to. When the club's lawyer reached out, quietly, through channels that didn't involve a badge, the clerk handed over 11 years of notes without being asked twice. 11 years of small red flags nobody upstream had wanted to chase, because chasing them meant admitting the system had been sleeping on its feet the whole time. That's what was in the second folder, the woman said. Not proof of one wedding, proof of a pattern, 4 counties, 6 years. She wasn't the first girl that man married off in a hurry. She was just the first one who ran fast enough and far enough and landed near somebody willing to stop and ask why. The girl looked at the veil in its frame, the lace gone the color of weak tea, and something in her face shifted, the arithmetic of it landing. So there were others, she said, before her. There were others, the woman agreed. Whether there were others after, that's the part the bookkeeping never tells you the whole of. She set the wrench down. But it's the part of the story I think about most. Not the day. The years before it that nobody was watching. Outside, a truck downshifted somewhere on the highway, the sound rising and falling and gone, and the woman stood there a moment longer before she reached for the second folder and began to tell her what was in it. The second folder was thinner than the first, which surprised the girl until the woman explained that thin folders were often the worst kind, that a stack of paper meant someone had been careless enough to leave a trail, and a few pages meant someone had been careful, methodical, had learned from whatever mistake had gotten the first 4 girls' families to go quiet. 4 names were listed on the top page, though only initials remained readable where a redaction had been done badly. The black marker faded to gray over 10 years of the folder living in a filing cabinet and, later, a shoebox, and, later still, a drawer in this garage that the woman opened maybe twice a year. This one, the woman said, tapping a line near the bottom, never made it to a courthouse. She was found 2 counties over, in a motel, before anybody filed anything at all. She didn't elaborate, and the girl didn't ask her to. Some silences, the woman had told her once, were doors you didn't open just because they were unlocked. The girl studied the page like it might answer something the woman hadn't said aloud. Did you know her? The one who... She stopped herself before finishing it. Some instinct in her understanding the sentence didn't need an ending. No, the woman said. I only knew the paperwork. That's the thing nobody tells you about doing this kind of work long enough. You end up knowing people through what's left behind, instead of who they were. A name in a margin. A date next to a filing stamp. She closed the folder, set it on the workbench beside the wrench, next to a coffee can of loose bolts that had sat in that exact spot, the girl would later learn, since before she was born. The bride in the veil, she got to be more than paperwork to me. That's the only difference between her story and the others. Everything else was luck, timing, a mirror at the right height on the right morning. The girl looked toward the bay door again, the highway a pale ribbon beyond it, heat already rising off the asphalt in visible sheets, though it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. What happened to the man? She asked. The one who paid off the officiant. The woman's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. That, she said, is the part that took longest to get right. Longer than the wedding, longer than the courthouse. It took 1.5 years, and it took more people than you'd think a story this quiet needed. She reached for the coffee can, not because she needed a bolt, but because her hands, the girl would come to understand, liked something to hold while she worked her way toward the harder parts of a memory. The wind through the bay door shifted, carrying the smell of hot tar and cut grass from the field across the highway. The same field, the woman said, though the corn had been soybeans that first summer, and something else entirely most years since. She turned the coffee can once in her hands before setting it down again, untouched, and the girl understood the gesture had done its work already, whatever that work was. The officiant folded first, the woman said. Small-town notary, did weddings on the side for extra cash. He wasn't built for what came next, a prosecutor's office asking specific questions, on the record, with a stenographer in the room. He gave up dates, gave up a ledger, gave up the groom's father's handwriting on 3 separate documents, which was the part that mattered most, because the father was the one who'd arranged the whole thing to get at land that wasn't his to inherit. And the groom? The groom, the woman said, and here she paused long enough that the girl thought the story might simply stop, unfinished, the way some of them did in this garage. She'd learned that already, in 2 days of listening. The groom claimed he didn't know. Maybe he didn't. That's the part I never got clean in my head. And I stopped trying around year 3. Some things you carry unresolved. You don't get to file everything away just because you want to. She wiped her hands on a rag that had been white once, decades ago, and was now the color of everything else in that garage. Oil, dust, sun. The father did 18 months, restitution on top of it, though restitution's a word that means less than people think when the money's already spent on lawyers. She looked at the girl directly then, the way she had a habit of doing when she wanted a fact to land instead of just pass through. The bride, she testified twice, once for the grand jury, once at trial. Both times, somebody from the club drove her there, and somebody drove her home. Not the same rider both times. We rotated it, made sure she never once had to ride alone toward a courthouse. Why does that matter? The rotating. Because a courthouse can feel like the same kind of hallway as the one you're running from, the woman said, if you walk into it by yourself. She picked the coffee can back up, this time because she meant to, and shook 2 bolts loose into her palm, turning them over, like she was deciding something. She used to say that. Not right away. Later. Once she trusted the words enough to hand them to somebody. The girl waited, sensing there was more, and there was. The woman's eyes had already drifted past her, toward the far wall where the veil hung in its frame, catching the early light at an angle that made the torn lace look, for just a moment, less like a wound and more like a doorway. The girl followed her gaze to the frame, and for a while neither of them said anything, because the light was doing something neither of them had arranged and it seemed wrong to interrupt it. Dust moved in the beam, the way it always did in that garage, unhurried, the way things that have been in one place a long time move. Outside, a truck downshifted on the grade a half-mile off, the sound rising and falling and gone, and the highway kept doing what it had done for longer than either of them had been alive. What did she trust, the girl asked, before she trusted the words? The woman set the bolts on the bench in a small line, evenly spaced, an old habit of hands that needed something to do while the rest of her worked something out. She trusted that nobody in this garage needed her story to be interesting, she said. Just true. That's a smaller ask than people think. Most folks want the version that makes them feel something. We just wanted the version that held up in a courtroom. She looked at the girl then, directly, the way she had in the field 10 years before with a stranger who would not come out of the corn until she'd decided the waiting itself was proof of something. She told me once that was the first time anybody had asked her for the truth, without also asking her to make it easier to hear. The girl thought about that longer than she thought about most things anyone told her, turning it the way her grandmother turned the bolts. "Did you ever ask her why him?" she said finally. "The husband, the real one after." "Once," the woman said. She said he was the first man who ever waited for her to finish a sentence. She almost smiled, the closest thing to it that morning. Low bar. She knew it was a low bar, but she said you don't know how low a bar's been set for you until somebody clears it without trying. She wiped her hands on the rag, though they weren't dirty, another habit, a way of closing one subject before opening the next, and looked toward the bay door, where the light had shifted a few degrees further into the garage, laying a new stripe across the concrete floor, across the old stains that would never fully lift, no matter how many times the floor had been swept and swept again. "There's a part I haven't told you," she said, about the day she came back. Not to run from anything this time. She reached for the coffee can again, then stopped herself, hands finally still. 2 years after the trial. Different season, same door standing open. The girl didn't move, didn't ask. She had learned, in the space of one morning, that the woman told things at her own pace, and that pace was the only pace that made them true. It was October that year, not August, and the difference mattered more than it should have. No heat shimmer on the blacktop, no cicadas grinding through the tree line, just a clean, cold light and a wind that smelled like cut hay from the fields 3 properties over. She remembered because she'd been wearing a jacket for the first time in months, the leather stiff from disuse, and she'd been standing in almost this exact spot, sorting bolts into a coffee can, when a car she didn't recognize pulled off the highway and idled at the edge of the gravel like it wasn't sure it had the right address. It had the right address. The woman who stepped out was not barefoot this time. She wore boots, sensible ones, laced tight, and jeans instead of a dress. And for a long moment the rider didn't place her at all. The hair was different, cut shorter, a color closer to its natural brown, and the face had filled back out the way faces do when a person finally starts sleeping through the night. It was the walk that gave her away. Nobody else crossed gravel like that, like the ground itself might still be counted on to betray her. "You kept it," the woman had said, looking past her shoulder into the garage, to where the veil already hung in its first frame, cruder than the one it sat in now. Just a shadow box the rider had built herself out of scrap pine. Didn't seem right to throw it out. Didn't seem right to keep it either. Guess that makes two of us who didn't know what to do with it. They'd stood there a while, not hugging, not yet. That came later, after the coffee, after the woman had walked the length of the garage twice, with her hands in her pockets like she was measuring it for something. She'd asked, finally, if the rider remembered the exact spot the veil had caught. The rider had pointed to the mirror, still on the same bike, though the bike itself had a few more scars by then. The woman had touched the mirror's edge the way people touch things in churches. "I'm getting married in December," she'd said, not looking up. Different courthouse, different man. A pause long enough that the rider almost filled it, and didn't. "I want it to happen somewhere that already knows what a real one looks like." The girl, hearing this now, sitting on the same overturned crate her grandmother had probably occupied 100 times, without ever being told why it was kept, finally spoke. "She meant here." "She meant here," the rider said, and looked at the bay door, at the stripe of afternoon light now nearly touching the workbench, and did not go on right away, letting the girl sit inside that answer before the next one came. The light kept moving, the way it does in a garage that faces west, indifferent to what's being said beneath it. The rider let the silence hold a moment longer, then pushed off the workbench and crossed to where the veil hung, glass catching a thin wash of gold at its lower corner. "December," she said again, like the word needed weighing. "Cold month for a wedding. Nobody plans a wedding for December unless the date itself means something." The girl frowned. Did it? 2 years to the week from the highway. The rider didn't look back to check if that landed. She knew it had. She never said it out loud. Didn't have to. "I looked it up on a calendar after, just to be sure I wasn't inventing something out of wanting it to be true. Wasn't. 2 years, 4 days. Outside, a truck downshifted somewhere past the tree line, the sound rolling in low and then gone, swallowed by distance the way most sounds were out here. The girl looked at the bay door, at the strip of 2-lane visible beyond it, heat still doing its lazy shimmer over the asphalt, though it was hours from the worst of the afternoon. "Did she ask you?" the girl said slowly. "Or did you offer?" It was a good question, better than most people thought to ask, and the rider felt something in her chest tilt toward the girl, the way it had tilted toward the woman on the crate a decade before, the recognition of someone watching close enough to notice the seams. "She asked," the rider said. "Wrote it in a letter, if you can believe that. Actual letter, actual stamp. Said she didn't trust herself to ask it out loud without crying, and she didn't want the first thing I remembered about the day to be her crying again." A short breath, almost a laugh, though nothing about her face agreed to it. "Said the courthouse was fine for paperwork. Said she wanted the vows somewhere the walls already knew what a promise was supposed to look like when it wasn't a trap." "What'd you write back?" "Didn't write anything." The rider nodded toward the bike, older now, retired to a corner near the tool chest, kickstand down, a light film of dust settling into the seams of the seat. Called the chapter instead. Told them to clear the calendar the second week of December. Told them why. Didn't have to say much more than that. They remembered the veil same as I did. The girl was quiet, turning that over, and the rider watched her do it, watched the particular stillness that ran in some families whether or not anyone ever taught it to them. "How many showed?" the girl asked. "The second time?" The rider almost smiled, the closest she came to it all afternoon. "Fewer roads to travel that time," she said, "but more of them stayed the night." December had come in hard that year, the kind of cold that turned the gravel lot to iron and made the rider's breath hang in front of them, like something they could almost reach out and touch. The garage doors had been open anyway, because that was the point. The same bay door, the same rafters strung with the same string lights someone had hung for a Christmas party a decade back and never taken down, because nobody could think of a reason good enough to. The bride had worn boots. Real ones, broken in, the kind meant for walking and not for show, and when someone had asked her about it, gently, the way you ask a question you already suspect the answer to, she'd said she didn't intend to run in these either, but she liked knowing she could. She stood right there, the rider said now, nodding toward a stretch of concrete floor, gone smooth and pale with age, near enough to the tool chest that a person standing in that spot could touch cold steel with an outstretched hand if the need arose. Didn't want an aisle, didn't want anybody walking her toward anything. Wanted to just be standing there when he came in, like she'd always been standing there, like the room had been waiting on her instead of the other way around. The girl looked at the spot like it might still hold some impression of that morning, some warmth pressed into concrete that decades of Missouri winters hadn't managed to lift out. Was he nervous? She asked. The groom. Terrified, the rider said, and there was something almost fond in it. Man had shaking hands the whole ceremony, kept looking at the doorway like he expected somebody to come tell him it wasn't real. Did anybody? Nobody had the heart. The rider's eyes went to the door, where the highway sat visible in its silver ribbon beyond the gravel, empty at that hour of the afternoon, running the same two directions it had always run. Officiant that year was a woman out of Springfield, retired judge. Wouldn't take a dime for it. Said she'd heard the story secondhand and wanted to be part of the part where it came out right. The girl was watching her now instead of the garage, the way you watch someone circling toward the center of a thing they've been careful not to name too quickly. And the veil, the girl said. Did she wear it again? The rider let that sit a moment, the way she let most things sit before she answered them, like she was checking the weight of a word before deciding whether it deserved to be spoken. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, slow, its engine fading east until there was nothing left of it but the cold and the light coming low and orange through the open door, catching dust in the air, the way it always did that time of year, turning it to something almost gold. No, she said finally. That veil doesn't leave this wall. She let the girl sit with that answer, the way she let the silence do work that words couldn't. Then she pushed off the workbench and crossed to the frame, running one knuckle along the bottom edge of it, not touching the lace itself, just the wood that held it. She came back with her own, the rider said. 2 years on. Different lace, different man, same rafters. The girl's eyes went up, following the beams, like she could still see something hanging there. Right here? Right here. We cleared the bikes out of the middle bay, and somebody's cousin strung lights along the trusses, and it looked like something out of a catalog for about 6 hours, which is longer than most things in this life get to look like anything at all. She said it flat, no wonder in it, because the wonder had worn into something steadier over the years, something closer to fact than memory. 300 of us the first time, maybe 60 the second. You don't need 300 to watch somebody get married. You only need that many to make sure she gets the chance to. The girl looked at her for a while without saying anything, which the rider took as a kind of respect, the young learning when a thing didn't need a question stapled to the end of it. What happened to her? After. Moved to Joplin. Teaches now. Sends a card most Decembers. The rider shrugged. Small. The shrug of someone who had made peace with the fact that most stories don't hand you a bow to tie them off with, just a slow tapering into ordinary years. That's the part nobody puts on a shirt. She got to be ordinary. That was the whole point. Outside, the light had dropped another degree, the highway gone from silver to the color of a nickel left too long in a pocket, and the rider walked to the open bay door and stood in it with her hands loose at her sides, the way she'd stood in doorways her whole life, watching roads she didn't have anywhere in particular to be on. You want to know what I tell people when they ask what it means, she said, not turning around. It doesn't mean anything grand. It means somebody ran toward you instead of past you, once, and you didn't waste it. The girl came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The highway ran on below them, east to west and west to east, the same stretch of asphalt it had always been, indifferent to what had happened on it, indifferent to what it had carried away, and what it had, once, delivered. Behind them, in its frame, the veil hung the way it always hung, torn, dust-caught, gold in the low light, not a relic of what had almost happened, but a